and we'll meditate for about 30 minutes until about 11. And I'll guide for most of it, leave some space for silence in there. Um, After that, we'll have a bit of a quick little break, and then Emily is going to lead us in some lovely mindful movement. After that, I'll give a little Dharma talk. Today, we're talking about less craving, but more desire. And then at the end, we'll have space for sharing and reflections, questions, answers, all that sort of fun stuff. So, yeah, I'm very happy to be here with you all, and we can go ahead and start finding our meditative posture, whatever that looks like for us. And often helpful to have an upright spine, but full disclosure, sometimes mine bends a little and it's okay. But just finding a space where we feel this sense of balance between calmness and alertness. And gently closing the eyes if that feels comfortable to do so. Maybe taking a few longer, deeper breaths as we settle in. Just aware that there is a body sitting and there is a body breathing. And as you become aware of this body sitting, this body breathing, you're just inviting any tension that's being held to release. Just welcoming a sense of softening to the muscles of the face, jaw, neck, just allowing the shoulders to drop down away from the ears. And just offering this softness, this unclenching anywhere in the body where it may be a benefit. Just allowing the outcome of this invitation to be whatever it may be. Maybe tension goes, Maybe tension stays. All we can do is offer the invitation. And as we settle into this moment, we're going to take a little space to recognize our motivation or our intention for being here this morning. Why are we here? Why are we meditating? Maybe it's to be loved and to be loving. Maybe it's to be happy. Maybe it's to free all beings from suffering. Maybe it's to challenge ourselves or to be in community. Just recognizing what wholesome desire brought us to this moment, to this place. Just holding this intention, this motivation, this desire in the mind just a little bit longer. And for some people, it's helpful to just picture an inspirational figure, someone that inspires you to meditate, to practice. Now just orienting the mind, the attention, the question of what is it like to be you in this moment, to be here and now. And not judging this moment or ourselves as good or bad, right or wrong. Just aware that there is a body sitting, there is a body breathing. Noticing the sensation of the feet against the floor, body against the chair. Be aware of the belly rising and falling. And the ribs floating from in to out and out to in. Be aware of the chest expanding and collapsing. aware of the air floating in and out of the nostrils. Just aware of all of these sensations as energy flowing. The vibrations, the tingling, the pulsing, the itching, the aching, dryness, the dampness, coolness, the warmth, energy flowing. And the minds may wander to stories, to analyzing, judging, planning. We can simply just notice this. Coming back to the sensations of this moment, the energy that's here and now, the molecules, the atoms. We can always take a moment to reconnect with our motivation, our intention, as a way of recentering in our meditation. And just coming back to the experience of the here and now, the impersonal movements of energy. aware of what it's like to be you in this moment, to be sitting, to be breathing. Be aware of the mind is believing these stories in this moment. Maybe a craving for the meditation to continue or to end. Maybe a pleasant or an unpleasant feeling. Just allowing this moment to be exactly as it already is. Energy flowing. And in your own time, taking a few final deep breaths. And whenever you're ready, gently opening the eyes. My talk is, as I alluded to earlier, it's titled Less Craving, More Desire. And there's a topic that sort of arose for me as this past week. I'm trying to figure out, okay, what should I talk about? And with that question, what should I talk about? There starts to be even the rising of anxiety. And for me, whenever there's this rising of anxiety, usually I turn towards, okay, what is my motivation? What is my intention? What is my desire to do this? And even just asking that, I notice a change in my own energy, a decrease in the anxiety, and a sense of spaciousness. And I'm able to be with this question of, okay, what is helpful to share with people? And, it's just a very subtle shift in my desire to essentially go from something that's very self-involved, which is, oh, what can I come up with that's very clever and good and people will like me for, versus, okay, what's actually useful to people? Desire to help other people. And, with all things generally, the less sense of self that's involved, the less of the anxiety. So that became somewhat the inspiration for my talk, is around desire and motivation, intention and craving. In particular on the difference between desire and craving in the Buddhist teachings. We learn very often early on that, okay, so craving is the enemy. And oftentimes we conflate desire and craving together. And I'll also talk in this about how craving is not necessarily the enemy, but we learn in the second noble truth that, you know, as the noble truth goes, basically that this is the cessation of suffering comes from the complete fading away and cessation of this craving. It's abandonment and relinquishment, getting free from and independent of it. So we're going to talk about desire and craving, how that might be related, how that might be similar, and we'll talk about two different Pali words in the language of the Buddha that are really useful for this conversation. So the first is tanha. Tanha is the word that is used for craving in the second noble truth. And tanha can be translated as it's like a thirst, sometimes an unquenchable thirst. And it's something that arises out of ignorance. It arises out of greed and hatred and delusion. And this is the primary cause of suffering. So when we think of tanha, we think of something that is unsatisfiable. Again, an unquenchable thirst. It's more of an automatic process that happens, particularly when we're not aware. But it is more like a feeling, an insecurity that arises, this certain feeling that often drives us. And there's three types of craving, three types of tanha. The first is sort of the most easy to understand, which is craving for sense pleasure, right? Chocolate tastes good, we crave for chocolate. Simple. The other two types of craving are craving for becoming and craving for non-becoming. So craving for becoming, sort of the craving I alluded to when I was talking about preparing for this talk, which is the craving for, oh, I need to become a person who gives a good Dharma talk. I need to be a person that people like when I show that I know all about the Dharma. That's craving for becoming. It is about being this certain type of being, this continuous sense of self that we're creating. And then craving not to become is somewhat the opposite. Craving for non-becoming is basically to not be a certain way, and particularly to escape certain painful feelings and experiences. So we have this craving for becoming a certain type of person. We have a craving for not becoming a certain type of person, not having certain experiences. So that's tanha. You can kind of feel there's like a tension with it. There's an anxiety with it, an insecurity with it. Another word we'll talk about is chanda. So chanda is the word we'll use for desire. It's often translated and understood more as a wise desire, a wise intention. And it's very much based off intention. It's thought of more as a choice than tanha, which is just sort of these patterns that happen when we're not being mindful, more based off, being human, but also our conditioning. But of course, we know that, none of us would be here. Like I asked you in the meditation, like, why are you here? If you had no desire to be here, you would not be here. So we have to have some desire. We cannot eradicate desire because then we would not do anything. So we have these desires, like for awakening, or the bodhisattva desire, which is to, help all beings awaken. And so chanda, basically we generate these wholesome intentions with chanda, and that gives us the energy, the effort that we need to continue on the path. Again, the energy or effort is often called virya. So these two types of, tanha and chanda, this craving, this unquenchable thirst versus this wholesome desire, these are two radically different things, and they often become kind of lumped together when we start learning on the Buddhist path. Oh, craving is bad, desire is bad. And so I have one more quote that summarizes what I just shared. It's from Ajahn Sucitto. He shares that sometimes tanha is translated as desire, but that gives rise to some crucial misinterpretations with reference to the way of liberation or enlightenment. As we shall see, some form of desire is essential in order to aspire to and persist in cultivating the path out of dukkha, suffering. Desire as an eagerness to offer, to commit, to apply oneself to meditation is called chanda. It's a psychological yes, a choice, not a pathology. In fact, you could summarize Dhamma training as the transformation of tanha into chanda. It's a process whereby we guide volition, grab and hold on to the steering wheel, and travel with clarity toward our deeper well-being. So we're not trying to get rid of desire, which would of course take another type of desire. Instead, we are trying to transmute it, take it out of the shadow of gratification and need, and use its aspiration and vigor to bring us into light and clarity. So I'll actually copy and paste that and put that into the chat because I think some people might appreciate that and it can be useful. Sometimes during these talks, I think that, I can start to confuse one word for another and totally lose the plot. So I shared that in the chat if anyone wants to refer to that, but that just summarizes a little bit of what I've been sharing about Tanha and Chanda. So the question that we want to answer is, how do we do this? How do we, as he described, Dhamma training as the transformation of Tanha into Chanda? So how do we do that? How do we transmute the energy? How do we sublimate the energy? Is a word they often use in Tantric Buddhism. So I'm going to talk about 3 ways of doing that, which do overlap quite a bit, but the first is reducing the power of Tanha. The second is increasing the power of Chanda. And the third is to find the Chanda within the Tanha. And I'll explain what that means when we get there. So the first thing about Tanha, again, this unquenchable thirst, this craving, is that craving is part of being human. It's part of being in the human form. So it's really important in our practice to not demonize ourselves for having craving. It is important because, I've had a teacher, Bhante Rahula, once described it. Yes, we want to reduce craving in order to see suffering, but craving is one of the final things to dissipate on the path. It's actually one of the final steps before we become completely enlightened. It happens in something called the non-returner phase. And I don't know about any of you, I'm not particularly close to complete and total enlightenment. So I have lots of craving in my life. And if we demonize ourselves for having craving, what we are doing is we are just fueling ourselves with tanha, with the sense of insecurity, with the sense of anxiety, that things need to be different than the way we are. And of course, our species is predicated on, wanting sex, on wanting food. Even the word thirst, right? If we are thirsty and we do not drink, we will die. So this is part of being human. So the first is we do not beat ourselves up over craving, even though we know that we are seeking the cessation of craving as an aspiration. But we can seek that without being attached to an outcome. So being human is just part of the experience that we're all having right now, and craving is a part of that. So recognizing that and accepting that, seeing it as impersonal is an important part of reducing the power of tanha. Because the larger problem with tanha is not that it exists, but that this craving can take over our lives. And obviously we know there are extreme examples of this with various types of addiction. But just almost anyone, we all experience types of anxiety. And I ask people all the time, sort of this question I posed at the beginning of the meditation about, what drives you, what motivates you? And oftentimes it's, the answer I hear, it's about craving. It's wanting to be a certain type of person or not wanting to be a certain type of person, or wanting these certain pleasurable experiences and not wanting these unpleasurable experiences. And when we do that, we oftentimes lose track of, those more wholesome motivations, those things that we really value, that we care about, the chanda. So, and this is an experience I've noticed in myself quite a bit as I've gotten more into the practice of feeling this anxious, insecure energy that I need to be someone who is very good at life, who is successful and good at giving Dharma talks and all these things. And when that happens and you repeat this cycle over and over again, you're losing touch with those positive motivations, like the desire to help other people, the desire to be connected to other people. And in all types of settings where I work with people in Dharma settings and therapy settings, I'm working with people who, like almost everyone says, oh, I procrastinate. I can't figure out why do I procrastinate. And then we try and figure out, okay, what's your motivation for doing something? And their motivation for doing something is often anxiety. We probably all did this younger when you're, in school or even now in work or whatever. It's like, okay, I have this something due in 2 weeks, but I just can't motivate myself to do it. And when I ask them about this, oh, well, what happens is then the day before something is due, they have this huge influx of anxious energy, this craving to, oh, I need to get this done or else I'm going to get yelled at, or I'm going to get in trouble, or I need to do this so that I become, people give me adulation. And of course, they can't connect with chanda, kind of the positive aspirations for they would do this, why they would connect to, the challenge of doing something, the fun of doing something. Like this often happens to people. We love to learn in school, which is sort of this wholesome motivation, but then we get consumed by the tanha, this craving around, oh, I don't want to mess up. I don't want to get an F, and then my parents are going to yell at me. And we have this craving takes over the more wholesome desires. So we start to lose our sense of what's important. So with reducing the power of tanha, we do not demonize the craving. We recognize that craving is part of the human experience, but we can actually use our mindful awareness to not attach to the craving. So in Buddhism, we talk a lot about craving and we talk a lot about clinging and attachment. And these are two separate things. These are also oftentimes confused for being the same thing. So tanha is different than clinging or grasping. That is called upadana. So we can have craving, but not attach to it. And so some of you may be familiar with the Buddha's teaching on dependent origination, which is something like a 12-step process for how suffering is perpetuated on a moment-to-moment basis. But basically, there is a process in which there is craving and then there is attachment to that craving. There is tanha and then there's upadana. And so what typically happens is the step before craving, it's called Vedana, it's feeling tone. So there's an unpleasant feeling or a pleasant feeling. The craving comes in and it wants more of that or it wants less of that. The attachment, sort of the buying into that craving, the attaching to it and identifying with it as, oh, this is actually what will make me happy. And this happens when we are not mindful, when we are not aware. The mind in the attachment phase becomes fixated, becomes obsessed. It starts believing that the craving is what we need to be happy. And upadana, the translation for it, is literally the word fuel. Attaching to the craving is fuel for the craving. So when we are mindful, we can stop the attachment to the craving. And again, a way of attaching to the craving is to say, oh, this is bad. I don't want this. That's a version that is a different type of clinging. So again, awareness of clinging without trying to push it away, without trying to hold on to it. We can allow craving to be there without letting it perpetuate the cycle of suffering. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go on. But we have the power, without eradicating craving, to take away the power of craving. And so that brings me to increasing the power of chanda, increasing the power of that wholesome desire, that wise desire. And this is the work I do in, Dhamma settings and therapy settings a lot. It's basically the question of how do we orient our minds towards our wholesome desires and intentions, towards what's important to us. And again, this can be as simple as sitting down and writing a list of what are our values. Okay, in the Buddhist practice, of course, we oftentimes in certain settings will chant the Buddha's words on loving kindness. And that is orienting our mind towards what is important, not just what's urgent or what we feel anxious and insecure about in that moment. So even being in Sangha, okay, sometimes reciting the precepts, which are commitments to abide by certain values, no matter how we feel. Again, tanha, the craving, is often powered by this feeling. But if we can take steps to feel rooted in community with the Sangha, in the sila, the ethics of the practice, then we are not so swayed by the tanha, by that craving. Okay, so another thing in Buddhist practice is reflection on death. Again, nothing helps us recognize what's more important than seeing that life is limited, it's short. In the Buddhist practice, there's the 5 recollections. They're basically centered around recognizing that we are subject to aging, sickness, and death. So is everyone else. So when we can do this, and I ask people in therapy, I have people write their own obituary, I ask people, okay, what do you want people to say about you at your funeral? Because this is orienting the mind towards what's actually important to us so that we can set wholesome desires. And there's space to reflect on great teachers or people we look up to, as I mentioned in the meditation as well. And there's also space to reflect on the suffering that tanha brings. Again, if we did not experience suffering, none of us would be here. So this is another way of inviting ourselves to recollect, okay, why are we here? What's important to us? How has that craving to be a certain type of person or to not feel certain things or not be a certain way? How is our craving for different types of sense pleasures? How has that brought us suffering? And if we can really reflect on that and be mindful about that, that can open a lot of doors for us. That can help us understand that even though the cravings are trying to help us in a way bring us happiness, they're actually not. So the more mindful we become, the more space we create, and the more power we have to choose our intention, to tap into chanda, rather than be fueled by the sort of anxious tanha, this craving, which is unquenchable. So we also have the space to respond to tanha with chanda. So the craving arises, I mentioned earlier, we can be mindful of it, we cannot attach to it. And that can cease that cycle of dependent origination that perpetuates suffering. We can also bring care and compassion to ourselves. If we notice what craving feels like, craving does not feel good. So if we can be aware of that craving as it arises, can we bring that care and compassion for ourselves? We can meet tanha with chanda, but we have to practice. We have to be aware of this process as it's unfolding. Again, that's kind of the Viktor Frankl quote that between stimulus and response, there's a space. In that space lies our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. So if we can do that, then we can be powered in our life by chanda and not by tanha. And so the last thing of the 3 options of how we deal with this is we can see that tanha and chanda actually want the same thing. So again, as we become more mindful and aware of our own inner experience, we start to see there are deeper desires behind the craving. And so we can deeply listen to what is needed, what is the craving really asking for. And we can explore our experience mindfully that way. And so I like to kind of test different hypotheses without truly knowing what will work and not work. And I highly encourage this for people. So if you're craving junk food, for example, what happens if you call a friend? Are you still craving junk food? If I'm craving validation, what happens if I scream as loud as I can? Yeah, I might scare the neighbors, but I might be craving validation less, or I might be craving it more. It's about experimenting. It's about exploring. We're all engaged in practice. Okay, if I'm craving, conflict, drama, what happens if I listen to a sad song and I cry? If I'm craving adulation? What happens if I send loving kindness to myself and others? So we can explore all these different ways. And, there's natural experiments that form in our life this way anyway. I work with people who have very strong, substance or behavioral addictions. And then they'll go on vacation. They'll go to a new place for a week. And they won't even have the thought around whatever substance or behavior that they're engaging in that's an addictive pattern for them. And so, as that, can we be aware of, okay, what's the need that's being met when we're on vacation? Maybe it's about avoiding certain triggers, or maybe it's about the novelty and stimulation of the experience. And maybe it's about being outdoors more. Maybe it's about being in connection with others who they're on vacation with. Hey, maybe it's just a lack of stress in their day-to-day life, or maybe it's the sense of purpose and adventure or a plan they have that week. But can we explore this for ourselves and trust that if we can be with the craving and almost get to know it tenderly with care, we can start to learn, okay, what's behind the craving? What are the real needs that are being met? I've read, I believe this was in the book, The Myth of Normal by Gabor Mate. It talks to people who have overcome very serious heroin addictions. And they basically just talk about, okay, they're almost trying to recreate the feeling of warmth and love and care and connection of the mother's womb, or being held by their parents as a very young baby. And it's like, so what are we actually seeking? So we all have this desire, this deeper desire to be, filled with love. And our cravings are trying to help us in a way get to those places. They're trying to, you know, we need to eat to feel whole again, or we need to, watch Netflix in order to feel numb, in order to not feel these certain negative feelings, or, the feeling of separateness. We need sex to feel close to another. We need a roller coaster to feel alive. Well, these cravings, these are all half measures. They're trying to point us in the right direction, but they're not actually getting us to where we want to go. And we do not want to pretend that we do not have craving. We do not want to feel like, oh, in my practice, if I just practice meditating hard enough, then craving will just go away totally. Okay? The path is not around, the path is through. Getting to know these cravings, getting to understand them, helps us connect to these deeper desires. So the Indian philosopher Nisargadatta once said that the problem is not that we desire, the problem is that we desire so little. And that is how I feel about these cravings, these experiences. They're trying to be proxies for the real things, but they're not. And it takes a lot of bravery, it takes a lot of mindfulness in order to push through the cravings, be with them, and find what's beneath them. What is the deeper desires beneath the craving? So my request for you as I end this talk is find these moments, not all the time, but find these moments of being brave and not settling for these half measures, not settling for half-heartedness. Allow yourself to be with the craving in order to crave less and desire more. So that's my talk. So thank you all for your very kind attention.